lessons learned. My name is Curtis Johnstone, and I'm a Microsoft MVP, Office Apps and Services. And with me, we have 3 other MVPs. We're all from Canada, as you may see. And we collectively call ourselves O365A team. So I'll give a little introduction myself. I'll pass it over to the other guys. But I work for a third-party ISV called Quest Software. So we build management solutions for Microsoft. And I work on the R&D side of the fence, helping build great management solutions. I have a lot of experience with Skype for Business. Of course, now it's mostly Teams. And for me, I have a lot of experience with PowerShell, the development platform for Microsoft Teams, and doing things like setting policies at scale using PowerShell to configure the service. So with that, I'll pass it over to Michael, and you can introduce yourself.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. This is our second time attending this event, and I think it was last fall. So I'm Michael Ameltang, 7-time Microsoft MVP, coming up from the Lynx, Skype Online, and now Teams world. I'm an independent consultant, and for the last year, the majority of my projects have really been around helping organizations roll out enterprise voice within Microsoft Teams. And that kind of maybe sets the stage for a lot of this content today, is that we come from the perspective of that external architect or advisor, with the mindset of what is the lowest common denominator to kind of move, rinse, and repeat, and get these large voice projects that may have tight timelines or support renewals that they need to get off their PBX. So a lot of this content is non-operational, is really coming into an organization trying to figure out where their journey is, and then moving them over to Teams telephony. And with that, I'll pass it maybe over to Dino.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, I'm Dino Caputo. I'm also an Office Apps and Services MVP located in the Greater Toronto area in a small town called Oakville. I've been an independent consultant for over 20 years now, focusing on all things Microsoft collaboration. I guess, like Michael, I like to consider myself like a technical coach. And these days, I mainly focus on Skype to Teams upgrades for larger enterprise customers. So I've been, for the last 12 months, been focusing all my time on those types of customers. Obviously, with the pandemic, there's been a greater desire to get onto Teams. And so hopefully we're able to share some of those insights with you through this presentation. It's great to be back at this amazing event, and I just wanted to thank our hosts and sponsors for having us again. And with that, I'll pass it over to Habib.
Yeah, hey everyone, Habib Mankel. I'm also a Microsoft MVP based out of Ottawa, Canada. I've been in the IT industry for almost 20 years, been a consultant for 9. And just as the guys have said, over the past year, I've been helping organizations, bring up their Teams environments, applying a lot of compliance and guardrails and governance to it. And then also, from a voice deployment perspective, migrations from Skype to Teams. A lot of my time today is usually spent within the compliance section of M365. So look forward to chat with everybody here today.
All right, thanks, Habib. So enough about us. We want to learn a little bit about our audience. Voice deployments can come in all shapes and sizes, different scales, different configurations. So we'd like to know a little bit about what your voice configuration looks like. So we've posted a link in the chat, which is to a very quick 5-question voice survey. So if participants could go just click on the link and fill that out, it'd really give us a good baseline for what the audience looks like. And while I look at those, Habib, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're going to cover today?
Yeah, so we have a few things that we're going to cover. We have also a few demos that we want to show for you, so it's not just all PowerPoint. So we, I think collectively we've done a significant amount of voice deployments, and some of them, larger than others. So we wanted to take everybody sort of through the process of how, we would go through that process and, share some of our war scars and lessons learned that, that we've been bit by before. So we'll go through some of the discovery, the planning, how do we onboard at scale, and like I said, the lessons learned from some of the things that we've gone through in our deployments.
All right. Just waiting for a few more responses to come in here. Michael, maybe you can tell us about the characteristics of some of these aspects of your voice deployment and why it matters.
Yeah, I mean, when we come in as advisors, the coach, as Dino was mentioning earlier, it's, in essence, it doesn't really matter the size of the organization at the end of the day. We are trying to figure out how to move them as quick as possible. And so, there's some process that we're going to go through of, data collection, cleansing, and generating PowerShell commands and stuff like that. Not all organizations have already gone through the process of maybe having a sale point or some kind of provisioning and deprovisioning process. So we really have to come in with that base knowledge of, if we were going to do from scratch, how do we get this large quantity of users enabled in different waves or different kind of scenarios. So a lot of these questions is just really understanding, some of the tips that we're offering. Is it focused, maybe to, sub 5,000 user organizations or larger? And then just understanding some of the common pain points that the audience may have with their journey. And so with that, we can, talk about some of the tips and some of the workarounds that we've seen for those problem areas.
All right, sounds good. Well, so the survey results have come in. Just cover off a few of the points. It looks like most people are within that 1 to 5,000 seat range, which is pretty typical. Interesting from a voice perspective, many people are using just regular Teams audio calling, and looks like another 30% just don't, or 25% don't leverage the voice capabilities at all. And then in terms of calling, it looks like it's an even split between calling plans and direct routing. Biggest enterprise deployment pains right now is Teams Admin Center, which is near and dear to Michael's heart. Number porting seems to be a bit of an issue too, so we can cover that. And maybe not surprising, given the audience where we're located, the primary geolocation for Teams voice deployment is the US. And current voice platforms being used, there's a healthy dose of Microsoft and a healthy percentage of people leveraging Cisco. And then there's Avaya and Mitel in the mix too, which is pretty standard, I think, guys. That's what you see often in your environments, right?
Yeah, and I think the results align with what we were expecting. So perfect.
Great. Awesome. So I'm going to kick things off here, and we're going to talk a little bit about discovery. So an important start to any good project is to perform the appropriate discovery. So we can't solve for what we don't know, and you won't have good success if we don't take the time up front to gather the information relevant to help you deploying phone system at scale. So what exactly are we considering here? We're going to spend some time covering off calling plans, direct routing, porting, licensing, and then finally data collection. And so, excuse me, while the intent is not to explain what each of these does, but rather about what information you need to consider so that you can achieve success at deploying these things at scale. And don't think about leaving early, as Michael has some juicy demos to show off when we get into data collection. So stick around. So before we get into some of the details, it's important to review the options you have with deploying Teams phone system, and that's calling plans and direct routing, the two options that are available there. You wouldn't want to go too far down the path of one of those options unless you've vetted the pros and cons of which option makes sense for you and the organization or your customer. So make sure you have those discussions in terms of calling plans and direct routing. We're not going to talk about the pros and cons again, but like I said, vet those out and then be sure of your strategy moving forward. Maybe you're going to decide on calling plans or direct routing, or maybe it's even a combination of both. You can certainly do that, but make those decisions certainly well ahead of your journey. So digging into to calling plans, if your organization is leveraging calling plans, it's kind of like buying a new house. As the saying goes, location, location, location. So calling plans require that every single phone number you assign to a user has to have a validated location, meaning the address is an actual civic address. So it's got to be a legit address that you're assigning to a user. So this is all for 911 purposes. So it's important you consider what physical address you're using for their emergency location. Take the time to really plan this out, especially now during a pandemic when everybody's working from home. While it might technically be correct to assign your organization's like main office address, from an emergency services perspective, this won't satisfy compliance with things like Kerry's Law or Ray-Bombs Act in the US, which aims at improving the information that emergency services providers receive when someone actually dials 911. So really be sure to look at that strategy and update everybody's location appropriately. Next, you need to look at number allocations. So how many different rate centers do you need phone numbers in? Like how many area codes are you doing business in? Does Microsoft even provide a phone number in the rate center that your users are in? And if they do, can you get enough numbers allocated for all your users? So if the answer to these last couple of questions were no, then you need to consider porting your existing numbers to Microsoft. So porting, move on to the next slide. So porting will allow you to move your existing phone numbers from your current provider to Microsoft calling plans. If you go down this path, you will need to get things like current invoices from all your phone bills that include numbers that you plan to port. Given, just gather all those equipment records and invoices because you're going to need to upload those to Microsoft for the porting process, and we'll cover that a little bit more later. If calling plans isn't the right approach for you, then you're left with direct routing, which is essentially lets you bring your own carrier to Teams. So with direct routing, you need to think about whether you need a physical session border controller or you're going to use a virtual one. So you both are an option. Or even if you don't need one at all, I like to follow the rule that if there isn't a hard requirement for an SBC, then don't deploy one. There are many vendors offering direct routing as a service now. So if you don't need to deploy one, then look at those vendors and think about maybe using direct routing as a service. Of course, if you're connecting to an on-prem PBX, then you'll have to get a certified SBC to do this. I wanted to share one experience I did with a large enterprise customer I helped upgrade from Skype to Teams. They had 30,000 users and 15,000 of which needed PSTN voice and were using it actively. And in the Skype days, they were using traditional SIP trunks that were attached to multiple SBCs in multiple data centers. So it's quite a complicated deployment that spanned geographies. But instead of following suit with Teams, which is simply upgrading the SBCs and installing, making them work with direct routing, we ended up using direct routing as a service and eliminated all the on-prem SBCs, which significantly simplified the deployment given the complexity was reduced. So, redundancy was still achieved through the provider, and the customer ended up saving a ton of money in operating expenses, as well as shorting the time to deployment. In terms of complicated network deployments, what I'll say is that Teams, the user experience getting the best user experience comes down to quality and location of the internet egress points. So the closer the client is to the Office 365 network, the better the calls are going to be. If there's one tool I can't recommend enough, and that's the connectivity@office.com testing suite. So you just head over to that website and it runs almost 700 tests. And from a client perspective, it lets you know about any challenges or issues you might face using all things Office 365. So do check it out. It's well worth running well ahead of your migrations and deployments.
Yeah, and maybe just to touch on a couple of questions that have come in the chat. So one question was emergency location information being handled when you're going the direct routing path. So if I could tackle that one. So the emergency information within the Teams admin center still could be leveraged. It depends on your provider for direct routing. So they may provide like a registered address service. You may need to subscribe to an emergency responder service, like something from Entrado West or bandwidth.com, where you could then pass the emergency information that is in the Teams admin center, in the Teams client detection, through PID flow up to those emergency responders. So it really does depend on that direct routing service provider and what those capabilities are. For the other question that came in, what's the difference between direct routing and Operator Connect? So Operator Connect is going to be going into preview, I believe, next month. And so what that is basically Microsoft working with a handful of certified vendors to package their direct routing offering. So this will be the ability to almost transact in the same way you would do calling plans within the admin center. You would be able to transact the setup of direct routing with a handful of these carriers. Now, keep in mind this program is rigid. It's kind of designed to be rinse and repeat. So the early offerings may have some limitations compared to the same direct routing managed service that these vendors may be providing in parallel. So it'll be interesting to see how the Operator Connect program evolves. But there is a handful of partners, and that's going into preview next month. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a question on the specific vendor that was used. The vendor I'm talking about is up here in Canada called Rogers, which is a major provider. And so they have certified direct routing as a service. And they're also, interestingly, on the list for Operator Connect as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Hopefully in the next month or two, we might be able to start seeing what Operator Connect actually looks like.
Yeah, I mean, right now, if you're watching on Twitter, you'll see that just searching for direct routing as a service, there is countless providers in North America and even globally. And it seems like every other week I'm seeing a new vendor that's offering their services globally or whatever. So it'll be interesting to see as we have the partner ecosystem building out their managed direct routing service. We have, telcos doing that. And then we have Operator Connect. We'll see, is it a battle to the lowest cost or with that or most offering or feature set? So it'll be interesting to see how this shapes up over the year.
Yeah, indeed.
And Michael, for the audience, there's Microsoft has a portal or a page that has all the certified vendors for direct routing, right?
Yeah, I believe it was announced at Ignite and as well as on Tech Community, but as that moves into preview, there should be more on the docs pages for Operator Connect. Also, just a note, Dino talked about porting to Microsoft for if you're going to go calling plans. If you are not spinning up an SVC and extending your existing services, and you go to a managed direct routing offering or the Operator Connect program, you will need to think about porting from your existing services as well to these providers. So keep that in mind. You may not escape the porting process, depending on how you're going to enable the PSTN services for Teams. with that, maybe I think, Dino, you touched on most of this. Is there anything else that you want to?
Yeah, a couple. I mean, there's a couple points on voice routing and dial plans from the previous slide that I can finish up, and then I'll move on to porting.
Perfect.
So just a couple things here with respect to voice routing. You'll need to map out your voice routes. The trick here is to create as few as possible to achieve what you're looking for. And with direct routing as a service, I often see carriers configure just a single simple voice route that sends all calls through it. So when you get into multiple geographies and more complex deployments, you probably need to consider how you want certain phone calls to egress out certain SBCs. Again, this doesn't need to be overly complicated, just create as few routes as required for what you're looking to do. And the same thing goes for dial plans. In fact, 99% of the cases you can get away without even creating a single dial plan in your tenant, as the tenant phone system defaults will always attempt to normalize numbers to E164, which is what all supported carriers will expect to receive calls in. Unless you're doing something fancy with translating extensions into full telephone numbers, I would say you won't likely have to do anything in dial plans with Teams. One thing I will say, and it goes back to location, is that you need to make sure you properly set the user's location in a phone system, as it will use the built-in dial plans to normalize phone numbers to E164. If you've ever gone to your tenant and you've done a get CS dial plan, you get like 251 pre-configured normalization roles. And these numbers can and will be used if your numbers aren't normalized when making calls. So just be aware of that. And unlike me, you won't pull out the rest of your hair when you can't figure out why your numbers are normalizing a certain way. So the pre-configured dial plans into the tenant will be used if you don't have a match on your own. All right, so now we can get into planning for porting. So the process of porting, again, is like moving your number from one carrier to another. So if you're using direct routing, you're simply porting it from your current carrier to the incumbent carrier, the new carrier. If you're using calling plans, then that's Microsoft. Microsoft's becoming your new carrier. So again, you're going to want to gather all the latest invoices that contain the phone numbers that you want to move. You'll need to scan and upload those to the new or winning carrier, as they're referred to. Every carrier is going to require you to fill out what's called an LOA, or a letter of authorization, that's signed by business contact for the customer, your business. Again, that's going to have to be uploaded. And with calling plans, I know Microsoft has different LOAs for toll-free numbers versus toll numbers, so make sure that you get the right form. All the porting requests are initiated via the Teams Admin Center. It is fairly straightforward. However, I can't stress the importance of triple checking the data you provide, as something like a space in a phone number, or the phone number is not in the right format, or any piece of missing information always generally results in a failed request. So that can be costly in terms of time. Lead times can wildly vary, and responsiveness, I'll just say, hasn't been great from the porting team at Microsoft. So get your ports in early and set your expectations accordingly there. As a tip, when porting numbers for direct routing, you can actually pre-assign the numbers on the team side, so that so when the port completes, it actually just starts to work. And you know, it's kind of, if you think about it, if you're porting 10 or 100 numbers, or even 1,000 numbers, with direct routing, the way you set the number, it doesn't actually check those phone numbers. So you can actually pre-assign them, and then when the port happens, they'll just start to work. So that's a huge time saver. In calling plans, it doesn't quite work the same way. In limited scenarios, I've seen the numbers appear maybe a day or two ahead of the port, which allows you to pre-assign them, but I wouldn't bank on that. They may not show up. And just lastly, take the time to consider the business impact in porting numbers. If you're porting a main number, you can try and request a Friday date so that you have the weekend for it to take effect. Some carriers will try to accommodate your port requests. You know, it seems to be less of a case when using calling plans. So just be aware of that. You might submit a date and get a totally different date back. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, please. So we're going to get into licensing, which is everyone's favorite topic, I'm sure. First of all, make sure you have the appropriate licensing available. This might require discussions with the licensing specialist to ensure you're getting the most value for your money. You might just be tempted to just get an E5 because it has everything you need and you don't have to think about, am I getting all the features? But if you're not leveraging all the functionality that an E5 offers, then you're likely spending way more money than is necessary. The probably number one problem I've seen with moving to Teams is at scale is related to licensing. It's when the user is lacking the appropriate license it always results in a failed migration. If you're trying to move from Skype to Teams and the user isn't licensed appropriately, it will result in a failed migration. So you might have the available license in the tenant, but you haven't actually assigned it to the user. So just make sure it gets assigned. And remember that it can take up to 24 hours and sometimes longer, as seen during COVID. So it's best advice is to assign the license well ahead of your migrations. I try to recommend at least 24 hours ahead of the migration window if you're scheduling a batch, for example. All right, enough said on licensing. We'll move on to data collection.
Sorry, just a couple things on licensing. Because the target audience, I think on this call is a lot of 1,000 to 5,000. Group-based licensing, is kind of like a no-brainer. Just go. I know it's additional costs on the Azure AD side, but the fact that you could just manage it with your sync processes from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory will reduce a world of hurt. Because especially if you start having different users having different features turned on and off under the E3s or E5 licensing, it does become a little bit of effort to manage or script to then all of a sudden say, hey, we're going to enable 400 users tomorrow to have this additional SKU because we've disabled it or whatnot. Also, if you're not doing it through any kind of automated process, like, hey, we're putting the users in the AD side into the group that's going to get the licensing. Make sure the team that is managing the onboarding are owners of the groups that are going to get the calling plan licenses or the phone system licenses, because then they can, build out one-liners or scripts to put the users into the right group to get the licensing features.
Yeah, for sure. Good points, Michael. A lot of my customers are moving into that direction as well. So have a look at it if you haven't already. So a wise person once said it's all about the Excel spreadsheet. So I would say that 95% of deploying Teams phone system is managing data in spreadsheets, which may not sound exciting, or it might for some people if, Excel rocks, right? So
it will be after you see Michael's presentation.
So, in all seriousness, successful upgrades and deploying Teams phone system at scale will require basically good data management practices. It's not enough to use spreadsheets and email them around. In fact, I can guarantee that if you do that, it's going to result in failure. You need to leverage Teams to store your files, for example, so that you can easily share them out and have multiple authors working on spreadsheets at the same time and not worrying about who's got the right version. Or use SharePoint if that works better. I had a customer that was really savvy in SharePoint, and so we managed the entire migration for this customer using SharePoint lists. So we all got together to meet to discuss what data points were required. So think about the username, the UPN, the address, the features that users required, what migration dates they needed to be migrated on, et cetera. So things like that. And created all these data points and put them into a SharePoint list. And then we wrote scripts for the actual migration that pulled those SharePoint lists based on the migration dates. So if we were doing on May 1st batch, we would just load the May 1st migration batch, or and then we would run it. And as that script ran, we would write back a value into SharePoint called isMigrated. And that was set to true, so that if the operator really didn't have to think about anything except just running that script and make sure it stayed running. So if it crashed or it timed out for whatever reason, all they had to do is restart that script, and it would pull the SharePoint list again and just only grab the users that were set to false for isMigrated for that batch date. So it was really a great process because it allowed us to run multiple migration streams. So we'd have like May 1st and May 2nd running at the same time, for example. Let us batch a weekend's worth of users and start them on a Friday night. And we didn't have to worry about each of the PowerShell script sessions collaborating each other to try to migrate the same users. So that really worked out well. And PMs love this approach because they could be watching the progress on their own by like just loading the SharePoint list and seeing what the current count of users were. So they could say, oh, they're halfway done, you know, without having to get constant updates from the migration team. And at the same time, the PMs are even working on the SharePoint lists, like the lists for the, you know, subsequent week migration. So it was kind of cool to do it that way. So, you know, in summary, just, you know, spending the time up front with the data management will pay off in spades when it comes to executing migrations. And on that note, I'm going to hand it off to Michael, and he's going to talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I think the big item here, and I think it came from our survey results, is try and do the majority of this outside of the admin centers, right? So, you know, use PowerShell when it makes sense. You know, of course, if you're doing one-offs or if you're just creating a single emergency address or maybe a few, you'll do that in the admin center. But if you're going to do 100 emergency locations, you're going to want to do that in PowerShell. So we'll talk about how we are linking Excel and PowerShell. But kind of in this category when we're talking about pre-deployment planning, you know, the art of Excel is going to be a big item. We're going to talk about generating PowerShell commands, you know, the one-liners to enable accounts en masse. Hav is going to talk about, you know, tackling some of maybe the limitations that we found with the built-in notifications that are within the Microsoft 365 kind of stack. And then some of our additional porting tips as you actually go to walk through the porting process to get to, say, calling plans. So as Dino mentioned, you know, he was fortunate enough that he was able to have, you know, some expertise at the customer site of this enterprise to tap into. So putting this data into SharePoint lists and pulling that data out and kind of manipulating those onboarding processes. And I've seen, you know, some of the larger, you know, enterprises that I've deployed to, they maybe use SQL databases that they dump all the one-liner commands as rows in the database, and they do something similar. They pull those out. But we don't always get to bank on those processes being in place and being able to bolt on to that. So Excel seems to be the lowest common denominator. I mean, of course, you can use Microsoft Lists now, you can use Power BI, but I find that, you know, for my case, you know, Excel has been, you know, the easiest way to do this at scale, and regardless of what customer I'm working with. So big thing is, like Dino said, you know, don't email Excel out, you know, put it into a team that's for the project, put it into OneDrive, never email it, just make sure that it's, you know, versioning and controlled, co-authoring, whatever you need. And it's funny, I mean, you know, don't laugh. You know, we have 4 MVPs on this call, maybe more that are in the audience, but, you know, 4 teams-focused MVPs that are starting to talk about Excel in the session. So there's reason. But really it's the, you know, a little bit of using some of the Excel functions and formulas with some knowledge could actually go a long way. You would not believe the, you know, the type of, you know, technical expertise I engage with some of these customers, and they're just shocked at what we're doing with simple Excel formulas. So I'll show you some of the kind of a sample worksheet, what I've kind of built and how I tackled some of these projects. So some of the critical, you know, functions within Excel, you know, concatenate is hands down been my, you know, most important function that I use in Excel. I've probably used it in some fashion in every project I've done in the last decade. So from, doing, hey, an organization's been acquired, we need to update all the default SMTP addresses, or we need to assign a whole bunch of phone numbers via direct routing enablement. It seems to be concatenate is my go-to function. And of course, it's great for generating one-liners, and we'll show that. So, hey, we need to generate a PowerShell command, exactly what we want. I've gone down the path of creating crazy scripts and loops and doing all the pulling of CSVs and doing all this craziness, generating the PowerShell commands on kind of on the fly. But there's just so much effort to troubleshoot, to make sure that this other organization has everything exactly the same, do some trial and error. So if you just generate the exact command you want per user that you're going to enable, it's just night and day. You remove all that administrative burden. So we'll show how we generate some of those one-liners using Excel. Kind of on that data cleansing side, text columns, replace, if statements, filtering, conditional formatting, really just used to cleanse the data, as well as maybe isolate specific groups or specific scenarios that need to be addressed. And when it comes to XLOOKUP and data types, these were new features released last year. I mean, you think, Excel has been around forever. I don't know how anyone used Excel before these have been released. So we'll show some of those. I use XLOOKUP all the time. I never touch VLOOKUPs, but XLOOKUP seems to be the magic ingredient to get these. And then I'm going to show you data types, which are fairly new, but also has changed how I approach some of these projects. And of course, you can't forget pivot tables, great for grouping data. I usually use this around licensing. So, hey, where are the users that don't have enterprise voice, or where are the users that maybe don't have a calling plan licensing? So really just finding the commonalities in data sets. So with that, let's jump into Excel. I was gonna say jump into PowerShell. Okay. So, it's really easy to generate one-liners with Excel. Kind of previously, I would just get everyone to send me their data, and I would copy it into worksheets, massage the data, and then really kind of apply my logic to it. And so I get the perfect worksheet that would generate all the commands, have all the color coding, all the different segments, and then the customer would say, oh, we have a new version of your source data. And then I would have to remember, okay, how did I, take this export from Call Manager and clean up the display names, or apply, remove any kind of characters, and have to go through the process over again. So I've, kind of learned not to work against the source data anymore, especially when they're just exports, point in time exports. So one of my first go-to things is now, I'm not sure, I believe the deck will be shared. So that's why we put a lot of the links into that. So we'll make sure to cover that. And then, or maybe our moderator could talk to where the recordings and content will be after the session near the end. So now what I do is, instead of copying the data right into the worksheet that I'm using to kind of manage the project, I use the get data, so that the get and transform data within the data tab in Excel, and I use those CSVs as a source of data. So now if I go under, say, queries, you can see in my worksheet I'm referencing two different documents, and if you hover over it, you can see that my source data is a CSV file. What I now do is apply all my cleansing within Power Query. So if I need to convert a data type or a phone number into text, I will do that within Power Query. And so that when the source data refreshes, I just reapply all my rules to it and bring it back in. So the simple one is, I'm just pulling a simple CSV. It was a dump from a licensing script, and we have a link to that licensing script in our decks. But basically, I dump all the sub items that are enabled for every user. And so simple kind of Excel is, I've done that data from text from CSV. I've basically promoted the first column to be the headers, And then I've just kind of converted every column to be in text. So, I mean, you can apply a lot more logic in here. The great thing is once you've kind of built out how you want to manage that source data, once that data refreshes, you hit refresh, it applies all your rules again, and then your data gets into your worksheet. Okay. From that, typically with the licensing information, I'll use a pivot table. So I'll pull that into another worksheet. This is a simple pivot table that just basically filters down based on the service name. And then I've just picked the enterprise voice one. This script, we'll show it a few times. It was written a few years ago, but it does have source files. So you can update the friendly names of licenses. You can add licenses that were not there prior to give the naming and stuff like that. So, I haven't made any changes, but, I know that MCO EV is the phone system, the enterprise, the phone system SKU. So I just go across all my users. Simply, I can see, who's licensed, who's not licensed, and then go send that back to the original or to the customer to go and address. Okay. So that's what I used to do until I found data types. So data types are pretty new, and it's similar way that you can pull data in from an external source. I mean, once Graph can talk to the telephony side, I'll be doing all these live queries, but we get a dump of get CS Online users to a CSV. I don't bother filtering. I don't bother removing columns. I just throw that to a CSV. I pull it in the same way, data, from text or from CSV. I do my, adjustment of the data, but now I convert that to a data type. And so if we take a look at this, and we'll go under this one that's a little bit different. So again, in Power Query, the big difference here between the last worksheet and this one is there's a feature at the top that's called data type. So if we go through our kind of process that I'm doing in Power Query, and I didn't have to do any of these formulas. I was just clicking the icons on the top. So I had my source data, then I promoted the headers to column, or the first row to the headers, which is just a click in the top bar. I changed all the data to text types, and then I click that data type at the top in this Power Query. And then after that, I'm like, I didn't really care about those, the PowerShell ID and the run space. So I just removed those columns. So again, we can apply all our rules so that when the data refreshes, it's applied again. But what you'll see here is these rows are a little bit different. So these rows have a little box icon kind of showing up on the front of it. When you click on this is actually a card. And this card will now pull all those properties that we have in our source CSV file. So now I can decide, I have all my users, but maybe I care about, display name. I can click on that, and now that column is fully populated with the display name. And maybe I want to care about, enterprise voice enabled. And maybe I care about online voice routing policy. So you can see I can just all of a sudden grab the data that I actually care about at that time and change on the fly. I can also, as we were talking about, I refresh the underlying CSV file. I could just hit refresh all, and you can now see that as it processes all the data, all that is populated again. So I didn't have to copy and paste. I just had to hit refresh and I'm off to the races. So I'm going to revert that for now, just back to our original item. So what the great thing with data types is we can create some reports. So this is, just a simple report I created. The simple here is, hey, I've basically taken that data type and populated it into a dropdown. So as that refreshes and there's more users in here, I have a drop-down list of all those people that I can reference. And so the great thing with this is now that this is you can see that we have that same card icon. I can reference this and populate. So if I went in here and I just went, equals C9, what are we on? Online voice routing policy. You can see it's populating. So now I can use that almost, I can almost use Excel as PowerShell, right? So I can even do, C9 dot line URI. And so I could start to build out little reports that are one-offs. I could have a second selection, and now I can compare two users side by side. So maybe I'm troubleshooting and I have user X that's working, user Y isn't. I can build a simple little report, grab the two users, compare their settings, see where the differences are. So pretty powerful. I don't think I'll ever go back without not using data types after seeing this, but then we can go further with that. So if we go into PowerShell generation, I'm just gonna close this one. So you can see here is, maybe we have the exports from Skype, Azure, we have the exports from Skype for Business Online, Teams, and then we have maybe a list from our customer. So our customer says, hey, maybe we are going to enable these users with these phone numbers. So now we can do things like XLOOKUP. So XLOOKUP is simply, what is the cell we care about? So we care about this specific cell. We're going to look at our data sets or our data type on that worksheet. And if there's a match on the display name, we're going to return the UPN. Because, when we're doing all our PowerShell, we care about the UPN. So you can see that a whole bunch of these have NA. So looking at these display names, they aren't, being detected. So we only have 3 users that we can work with. So maybe they haven't been provisioned, maybe they haven't been migrated from the other tenant, or maybe our data set is old. So if we refresh our data set, as it processes everything, so you can see, what that list looks a little bit better now. We can also go further, we can decide that, hey, we don't like NAs, it's not pretty. Maybe we'll go in and start using, if error, instead of having the NA, we can say no, and then put yes if there's a match. So we can start to kind of layer in these functions to say, hey, this is the target group because they're in this location, or they're enabled for licensing, or they're within the porting document that we've submitted at this date. So we can start layering in simple Excel to really kind of generate what we're looking to onboard. Again, we can do other XLOOKUPs. We'll go over a little bit further to the PowerShell side. So simple PowerShell, I'm just generating one-liner commands. So that's, again, that concatenate function. So it's basically taking a bunch of text, inserting specific variables, and then generating the one-line command that I want to copy and paste. And so I put in a little bit of logic. So if they aren't licensed for phone system, if they're not licensed or have a phone number assigned, I'm going to skip generating the commands for them. Now, I could take this formula and just double click on the bottom corner. It'll go all the way down all my rows, or I can drag the formula and it populates all the commands. So now I could just basically take an authenticated window, go into PowerShell IC, connect to connect-Microsoft Teams, hit run, and it's off to the races. I could be working with a team that is maybe not comfortable with PowerShell, maybe has never seen PowerShell, and all they have to do is authenticate, copy, paste, hit run. A little trick is I always put in a write output at the start of the command, just because when you're putting a batch bunch of one-liners and hitting play or hitting run, it doesn't give you any visual feedback until it fully complete. So if you do a write output, then at least you know where it is to follow the progress, or if there's an error, you could tie it back to the command that you actually ran. So definitely you can enable thousands of users within a short amount of time without having to write a single script and pull a source data. Okay. Similar to that, so with direct routing, the big ones are enabling for enterprise voice, also maybe applying voice routing policies, maybe applying licensing, maybe applying dial plans. You can generate all those one-liners, just go one after the other. Sometimes in PowerShell, I'll use the semicolon to run 2 commands in one, but that's usually just used for the write output and the command that I care about. As we go into calling plans is a lot harder to do than direct routing from PowerShell. So in calling plans, we need the emergency locations defined and functioning. we need the inventory already in place before we can assign it to the user. Of course, we need licensing. With direct routing, as Dino said, you can run this anytime. And once the port happens, then everything is flowing. With calling plans, until those numbers are showing up in the event portal, you can't assign those numbers. So I like to, with calling plans, I like to work around the address. So we have a whole bunch of addresses for our organization. We will tie a user to that address. We may decide what default conference bridge is tied to that address. And we may decide what is the city code for to pull it from inventory or for number inventory. That's also tied to that address. So we kind of use that address as the anchor point as we go to enable users. We may dump all the Microsoft inventory, so all the unassigned phone numbers. If you're not, maybe you're sourcing all net new numbers instead of porting. And then from there, simple, simple formulas. Let's decide, based on their office location, we'll pull the emergency location ID. We'll pull what conference bridge they should have, what city code they should pull a number from. And then again, we're just taking this information and generating PowerShell commands. So a simple write output, we're going to do a set online voice user command. This time we're going to put the location as well as their phone number. And then if we want to go in and update the conference bridges, set CS Online dialing conferencing users. So pretty easy to generate the PowerShell that you need. All you have to do is make sure you know what the format of the one command you need, and then you put it into an Excel formula, drag it down, and you're generating all the commands you need for thousands of users. Okay. Any input, guys, that you would want to add to that before I jump in or jump over?
I was just going to say, if anyone's mind is blown, it's okay. We got you. I think,
it happened to us the other day when we got the same demo. Yeah, I think the main point is, there are still a significant amount of people that are not familiar or don't know PowerShell. And, as we're talking about this from a scale perspective and managing larger environments, I mean, that's really the best approach to do that. So the reason why, pumping in the one-liners and providing those to the end user, they don't have to just think about anything, right? They basically just have to copy and paste and play. And if their session times out, they know exactly where it errored out, and then they can just re-authenticate and then copy and paste again. So I think that's a really good point. So if you're not familiar on the PowerShell side of things, don't fret. I mean, you can just build the one-liners as Michael did, but it's something that you should definitely start looking into.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, we're so excited about Excel, but it's just that it's solid. If you make a mistake in the command, you can adjust one line and then just drag it again. You don't have to rewrite your whole script. And one-liners are powering migrations for customers from 2 users to over 300,000 users. So they may take it, maybe tackle it in different ways, but it seems like regardless of your organization size, you're generating these one-liners to really provision or deal with these accounts. And it's just, where are you storing those, how you're pulling those and reporting on those. Excel is the easiest way to do it. But if you're, larger, you may have, other methods to store this information.
Yeah, and I think just the last thing is the, what we sort of went through on one of our deployments. Michael and I, worked together on one. Is I think as he mentioned, we tried to get a little fancy by pulling numbers and stuff like that, and generating or assigning numbers sort of on the fly, which took much longer to process from a PowerShell perspective, as opposed to just having the user's phone number that you're assigning there directly. It went from like 60 seconds per user to like maybe a second per user in the processing, which from a timing perspective, if you're doing a cutover for thousands of people, it definitely cuts a ton of time off of your hands. So,
yeah. So with that, maybe I'll pass it to Hab to talk about some of the roadblocks that we hit recently with user notifications.
Yeah, so from a notification perspective, when assigning those through the Teams Admin Center, a couple of places where you can have those applied or not applied, depending on what you're doing. So whether you're assigning a conference number to a user will automatically get an email when they get the conferencing license assigned to them. And it'll say this is your default conferencing number. And then also the ability sort of when assigning a phone number to a user as well, right? You have that ability to email the user their telephone number as well. But trying to do this at scale from the admin center was not happening, right? Because you can only do it on a single person when assigning sort of the bridge number or telephone numbers, and then as the emergency locations as well. So what we had to do was obviously come up with the PowerShell side of things to be able to do that. We also had some language requirements from our perspective. Up in Canada, we have 2 official languages, English and French, and there's a requirement legally to be able to send the notifications out to the end users in both official languages. So what we ended up doing is we felt that, from a bridge perspective, the user already is notified that they already have conferencing enabled for themselves. So we didn't bother creating an official language email for that. What we actually did was we were able to grab a phone number in every major city that this organization had offices in, and then with the calling plan location, we assigned the appropriate a conference bridge. So if they were in Calgary, we would associate a Calgary number. If they were in Toronto, vice versa, right? So we were able to generate those, and then that way it provides the end user the ability to have a local number, because most of the time people sort of are working with people within their region most of the time. Maybe a bit different nowadays, but we felt that was a better user experience for the end user perspective. And then from the assigning of the telephone number, Michael, if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what we ended up doing is we had to come up with a way to send out an email with both official languages. So I don't know HTML very well, or really not well at all, but I came up with a HTML template that had some tags that would be replaced, or had that basically would inject user information within the template. So the PowerShell script, Michael cleaned it up as he wrote it as a function. I had it as a bit of a loop. But basically what it does, it just gets the template that we have defined in a specific location. And then there is 2 fields, a phone number and a display number HTML tag field within the template, that as it would process the email, it would get the user's information, and then it would input them into the email. And then the open Teams or Revere Teams is a hyperlink for them to actually click on the mail and click on the link, and it would open up their Teams to be able to use telephony functionality. So again, there's some things that you have to try and do in order to work around these things. But this was sort of one of the situations here, right? So from an adoption perspective, it was huge. We also built some quick start guides for the end organization on how to use voice and how to enable telephony. Our plan for next steps were to deploy the learning pathways, but we obviously needed something to provide to the communications team to send out for those users that are going to be onboarded at that time. So.
Yeah, and I think the reason why we turned it into a function is, again, try and make it as simple as possible. So we just basically loaded it up as a simple function, open ISE, hit run, do our authentication. And then in Excel, we just generated one-liner commands again. That was call the function with the data that we wanted to put in it, and just copy and paste, hit run it in ISE, and we were off to the races. So again, we didn't have to think about loading data, cleansing data, any of that stuff. We just generated the one-line commands in Excel, and then we just used the function, which we had to rewrite a few times because the organization had different emailing servers. So All it was a simple couple tweaks here, load it into memory, put your copy and paste, and off to the races.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think Dino mentioned it above. Whether you're doing porting tips, well, this is primarily for Microsoft, but if you're going to be porting from one carrier to another direct routing carrier, I mean, usually they have a team that will work with you in order to do the porting for your phone numbers. But if you're doing it from a Microsoft perspective, there's a few things that you need to know, right? Obviously, you want to try and submit your porting request as early as possible. So if you have a date that you want to do your deployment on, try and get your porting request, at least 3 to 4 weeks in advance to be able to get the responses that you want. If you're doing it from the admin center, there is a limitation for just under 1,000 numbers to be able to port. Most people try and do them on a Friday afternoon, so there's definitely a lot of requests, which puts a load on the team that is actually executing the porting requests. So if you try and do them earlier on the Friday or even like on the Thursday, you probably get a better response from the team and faster execution on that side of things.
Yeah, and have the I believe the porting team also doesn't work on the weekends. So if you did a port later in Friday and you had an issue, you're waiting till Monday. So definitely avoid Friday altogether if you can, if you're going to submit your ports.
No, that's a good segue to the next point, because I've had a lot of cases where I've submitted my numbers as a specific type, and then they were ported in as a different type. And then you need to email the team back and say, hey, you need to modify these numbers either from a service number to a user number or a user number to a service number. And you can't do that over the weekend, right? So that's a really good point there. If you're going to be porting like a new number request, so not porting, but you're going to request new numbers to be ported, I should say, you need to send an email to that specific email address, and you'll have to port for every carrier that you're going to be, or submit an email for every carrier and account that you're going to be submitting that on. So what we've noticed over the past year, that the porting team was definitely, I think, lacking, in resources. People there actually physically being able to do it. Definitely the pandemic, I think, escalated, us being able to see that. What we've noticed is that they've have an increased members on their team now, faster responses for some of us here on the team, improved tools, and updated backends. And there's some articles that are on docs.microsoft.com that walk through the appropriate porting request process. We've also given feedback on that because we feel that it should be also different as well. So. Next slide. Okay, so now that we've done our planning, we built up the spreadsheet, we put our porting requests in. That's happening, but how do we actually get numbers from the team's admin center? How do we navigate those numbers or request those numbers on a large scale deployment? Some recommendations, things that we worked around from a service number perspective. Kurt's going to talk to us about some PowerShell limitations and timeouts and ongoing operations moving forward. So I mean, if you haven't done it before, but within the Teams Admin Center, you can go into the voice section and request under phone numbers, and request phone numbers within that in that management. So you can request for certain areas, and it'll tell you how many numbers that you can get. Sometimes you'll get them, sometimes you'll not. You won't be able to. But as we talk about this from a scale perspective, it's definitely much difficult to do it within the admin center. We mentioned, we do a lot of our stuff in PowerShell. So when we're trying to get, there's some of the commandlets here that have some limitations to them. So, get CS online voice user. If you just run that, if you have 1,000 users, it defaults to 100. So you actually need to expand that and say like first 1,000. It only returns the name and ID, but it doesn't return the UPN. But if you keep expanding, you'll be able to get a little bit more information within that. I think one of the things as well is just having to map the ID to the user was definitely one of the challenging parts as well. Same thing for the dial and conferencing users. It does have a limit on the results limit that it returns, so you have to just sort of expand that. And then the same thing from a telephone number perspective. So I think, I'm not sure if it's on this slide, Michael, or on the next one, but one of the things obviously you want to do from like a number management perspective is, just understand sort of the flows and what the commandlets do and how to do sort of this at scale. The other thing as well is, we wanted to be able to grab or capture a number of users. So Michael and I did like a large, 5,000 user calling plan deployment, and we were trying to capture a lot of numbers in certain rate centers or locations. So what you could do is you could send them email to that email address that we showed on the previous slide and say, hey, I need phone numbers in this location. And then you'll basically work with them in order to get that going. Or what you can do is you can use this script from O365 scripts. And basically, Michael did I think you did a little bit of massaging on it, but basically what you can do is you can say, okay, these are the locations that I want to get numbers for. And then you can start digging into, right, we did it on provinces, and we can start digging into the province and seeing what numbers are available there. And when you click on them, it'll tell you the different area codes, and you can say, how many numbers do I want, right? And then from that, it will try and request all those different numbers. And if you're successful, then you'll get them. So we also sort of went through, Michael talked about the number inventory monitoring, but basically, we wanted to try and get the numbers as fast as possible. We were running out of phone numbers within rate centers. So he'll talk about the automation from a notification perspective. But basically, we found this a faster and easier way to be able to capture these phone numbers, because you're just using PowerShell to get them. And the nice thing about doing it this way is you don't actually have to assign a location to it. So at the time of your assignment to the user, you can assign the location, the emergency calling location. So Michael, I'll pass it back over to you for this set.
Yeah, I mean, as Hab mentioned, this script was pretty much a lifesaver, because we would send an email out and they would say, maybe estimated 3 weeks to get the numbers. And for the customer we were working with, we needed all the inventory, and it was all net new, so not porting, in place before we could schedule the actual communication to go out to say when the enablement was going to happen. So we couldn't wait 3 weeks to maybe get some inventory from some of these locations. So this PowerShell script that we found on GitHub, basically we tweaked it a little bit to kind of narrow down where we were looking, and we were able to, within a few clicks, we were to grab as many numbers as possible in that location. They would report back how many it grabbed, and we would just keep rinsing and repeating. And so, as Hav was mentioning, we depleted quite a few rate centers consistently over a couple of weeks span. So what we would do is grab all of the inventory that we could in the locations that we needed, because we were trying to get 5,000 plus numbers available at the ready. So then we took some of the code within that script, and we basically just threw it into a function, and then it would just email us. So it basically would run every 15 minutes. And once we found that an area code within that certain rate center that we were monitoring had some inventory, we would go, send a message to the customer like, go, take as many numbers as possible that shows up. And then if we get an alert later, that would be like, within a few minutes saying that rate center is gone. And then, within 24 hours, maybe a few more numbers would get released. So it was definitely a lot quicker for us to get all the inventory we needed, kind of doing this in parallel of kind of waiting on the Microsoft kind of to get us a block of numbers.
Yeah, so it's funny enough, we asked for a block of numbers and we didn't hear back in a short period of time. So we were just depleting rate centers. So it's kind of funny. It almost felt like they were putting the phone numbers within the rate centers and we were grabbing them before they could email us and say, here's all the numbers that you wanted. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the same thing goes to if we needed a telephone number, a conference bridge number in a certain area, but we couldn't actually get it through the admin center. One workaround that we did, or a tip that we did, is we requested a user license, a user phone number in that location, and then we emailed the team to say, hey, can you flip this from a user number to a service number? And then we had the service number there. So that being said, I think we've talked about this a little bit enough. So maybe we'll just pass over back to you, Michael.
Yeah, so just kind of what we showed a little earlier on my Excel demo is there's a simple script out there that just dumps licensing. I still use this one as my kind of export. So we have that in the documents or the slides. So if you want to check it out, we'll grab the slides after. So with that, I'll throw it to Curtis to talk about some scalability items around PowerShell.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So as you can see throughout this the whole presentation, PowerShell plays a pretty important part to both that initial cutover and provisioning of M365 phone system. I have a lot of experience using PowerShell at scale for setting things like policies, configuring voice settings on user accounts. So just some tips and lessons learned here. Just to step back for everybody who doesn't know, but a lot of the commands you use to configure M365 voice are what we call the legacy Skype for Business online commandlets. And they're pretty easy to distinguish. We've seen a number of them in these presentations. They have the -CS basically. And about about 4 or 5 months ago, Microsoft released a new Teams PowerShell module that have these Skype for Business online commandlets in them. So you don't have to use the legacy Skype for Business online PowerShell module. You can do it all out of the new Teams module. However, the limits, the throttling scenarios that existed with those commandlets in the old Skype for Business PowerShell module still exist in the new Teams PowerShell module. So these are some limits that you want to be aware of, especially when you're doing that initial cutover or you're doing batch updates to users. Again, things like policies and configuration items. So some of the big lessons learned here, and these aren't well documented, so it's trial by fire, but there is actually official documentation which outline two big limitations you'll want to be aware of. First of all, the number of Skype for Business Online PowerShell sessions you can have per credential, and that credential is the admin credential that you authenticate with, is 3. So if you try to establish that 4th session simultaneously with the same credential, you will get an error and you'll get blocked. And likewise, at a tenant level, there's a limit of 10, which seems like a lot. You'd actually be surprised when you start to do the PowerShell work of deploying at scale, how quickly you can hit these limits. Another limit that people often hit is this resource limit. And in the context of this conversation, a resource is a policy, a user, basically any object that you're running PowerShell against. The throttling depends on how many concurrent sessions you have and the type of resource you're accessing. But basically, if the service starts to get too strained, you will get throttled. And there's basically 3 levels of throttling. First, you'll start to get warning messages back. And if you don't throttle, you'll start to get slower responses from PowerShell. And then finally, you'll just get blocked. You'll get a hard denial, and the PowerShell commandlets will just start to fail. So that's something you'll want to be aware of. And another good thing, just lessons learned from being out in the field, is especially around policies. So setting enterprise voice policies on user objects, when you do a lot of them, there's many times a latency between the write and the read. So you may set a policy on a user object, and if you're doing thousands of objects at a time, when you make the call to actually make the change, it'll come back. But if you do a read right away, it looks like the policy's not set. It just takes some time to replicate. And that time is variable. Typically within 15, 20 minutes, it'll update. But I think all of us have seen latency much longer, sometimes up to 6 to 12 hours. So a couple of tips there. If you're doing batch operations on thousands of user accounts, it's always good to just try to break them up into smaller batches of like 1 to 200 and wait for that to flush through the system and then do another batch. Also, unlike number porting, if you're setting something in PowerShell that's user facing that the user will see that affects a feature, doing batch updates on Friday afternoon is never a bad idea. Because that sort of gives the weekend to flush through the system again. And one final tip here is if you've done something in PowerShell and an end user is actually waiting on that to show up in the Teams client from a voice perspective, many times actually starting the client will update the policy and it'll actually show in the Teams client. Whereas if you just wait, it can take some time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael. I think you were going to do a quick demo of Cloud Shell. I think we got about 9 minutes left.
Yeah, we're getting close on time, so I'll kind of go through the next a couple items pretty quickly. So the reason why we're bringing up Cloud Shell is there is a common theme working with organizations that are maybe new to PowerShell, where you're battling getting PowerShell to actually work on the person's machine, right? So they may have to use jump boxes, they may have to, install PowerShell, they may not have the appropriate permissions, or they have group policies that block WinRM basic, which is the most common roadblock I run into with organizations. So Cloud Shell is just basically the ability to run a PowerShell instance that's kind of in a container that's within the MN portals. So this has started to be my go-to push working with organizations that are not familiar with PowerShell, that are doing like direct routing enablement, that they do have to paste those one-liner commands, but they do need to authenticate. So if we go into the admin center, and I'll just jump over to one. So Cloud Shell is really simple. I'm in the Microsoft 365 admin center. You'll also see this in the portal.azure.com admin center. But basically, you'll click on this top icon. If you haven't provisioned it yet, it's going to ask you for an Azure subscription. That Azure subscription is really just to store the image for the PowerShell instance. So if I go over to, and while that's loading, you can see, for the month of April, it cost me about 40 cents for the storage. The actual item is just a simple image file that's in a storage account. So, you may have to, do a pay-as-you-go or get the admin teams to unlock a location that you can put this image in. But I highly recommend having this ability. So now wherever I have a browser, I can sign in and launch PowerShell. Now, the first thing to note is the Cloud Shell image today has an older version of the Teams PowerShell module. So you'll want to run update-Microsoft Teams, get at least a version 2 or newer. Also, to authenticate, there is no ability to pop out the modern authentication window. So what you would do is connect Microsoft Teams like you would before, but there's a parameter that's called use device, and check my my demo typing skills, but use device authentication. This will give you a URL and a code. So my process is copy the code first, click the URL. It's a nice clickable link. It's going to give you an authentication window. Authenticate with your admin credentials. Maybe that's in a privacy browser. You'll give it the code. You'll pick your account. And then after that, it'll basically say you can close this window, go back to your PowerShell window, and you're authenticated. Now I can do all my get CS commands. I can paste in commands. I now have a portable PowerShell window that can go in and enable. Okay, with that, just because of the interest of time, what we'll do is also jump over to self-diag. So there's a bunch of commandlets that are built into the service request that can do some testing for you. And so some of these have actually been pretty important for direct routing. So if we go under, in your admin center, create a new service request, there's a page that we have in our slide deck that has all the self-service commands. So everything from problems with sign in, the calendar app not showing, not able to find where my meeting recording was now that it's been moved to OneDrive and SharePoint. That's a new one here. But a simple one like, hey, I can't see the dial pad for calling plans, or I'm having issues with direct routing. So I can go in here, I type in, so this one's just the meeting recording one. It says, give us a URL and a date, and then it'll get us the where our recording is stored. If we do the direct routing one in here, it will just basically ask us for the UPN of the user. This has been the only place I can actually confirm the user experience. So say a scenario is we're doing a mass enablement, and a user on the Monday morning says, I don't have the dial pad. Well, you look on PowerShell, everything looks fine. You look in the admin center, all licensing is great. You look in the debug logs, and yeah, the user doesn't have the sign in or the dial pad. This test, the self-diag, will actually go into the backend databases and will say, hey, this user is not enabled for enterprise voice. Whereas nowhere else that you could see as an admin would say that same information. So definitely, if you have a one-off that you're just scratching your head and can't figure out why, run this tool. It'll tell you, hey, this result is what Microsoft Online is seeing. Now it's maybe disable the user for a few hours, re-enable them, or whatever your activities are to resolve the issue. Okay. So with that, I'll maybe open it up to the team for some lessons learned. And we have 2 or so minutes, maybe 3 minutes left. Everyone's silent. I'll just go over to some scenarios. So some of the roadblocks that we hit and we kind of touched on is validate your addresses if you're doing calling plans. So we have a user that, or we had a customer that enabled like 100 locations in the portal. Everything was validated. Everything was great until they put a phone number under that address. And then we had an error. So make sure before you do your onboarding day that you at least put a single number on a single user on that location and validate that there's no problems. The other one that we touched on was that, and well, this will be our last slide and I'll throw it to Tim, is when we go dynamic, there could be chaos. So we went down the path of, okay, here's all the inventory in this location. A user's tied to that location. Let's pull the next available number, assign it to a user. Well, depending on replication on the Microsoft backend, if a number is pulled out of that unassigned list and assigned to 2 people, it can happen before replication prevents it. So we had a scenario where our full migration came to a complete halt because about 50 numbers in a couple of different rate centers were assigned to multiple users. And so when we looked at the admin center, we had null values, and the only fix was take the user that had the full number assigned to them, remove it from them, put it on the user that had the null, then remove it from them, and then put it back to the original user, get a new number for the old one. So if you ever see this scenario, I hope you never do. It's all because we were trying to be clever with PowerShell instead of just assigning the direct number. And so with that, we ran through a lot of content. I want to pass it over to Tim, and thank you for listening to us.
Thanks.